Let's have a look. Right, try talking again, Ville.
Okay, I'm trying to talk again.
Oh yeah, okay, you can talk. That's good. Now we know you can talk. And I love that sort of obvious but not obvious display of your book just behind you.
No, you know why? Because I can do this.
Ah,
So I was in a
thought about
meeting this morning and they said, "Oh, have you read all of the books on the shelves behind you?" And I was like, "I have read all of them and I have written one." And now I've worked out exactly where my seat needs to be for me to be able to do that. What I can't show the clients when we're in meetings is what my t-shirt actually says.
Now I'm ready.
Now you're ready. All
Now
right.
I'm ready.
Leda, are you ready as well?
I'm born ready.
All right, here we go.
Welcome to Fintech Daydreaming, the podcast that dives into the world of banking technologies and the ever-changing landscape of fintech companies. We bring you real-life examples from global and local thought leaders, as well as experts working within the financial industry, and seek out the best stories from the front lines of financial services innovation, where dreams of industry pioneers meet reality. Hosted by Paul Krogdahl and Ville Sointu. This is Fintech Daydreaming.
Hello and welcome back to Fintech Daydreaming. My name is Ville Sointu and I will be your host today for this special episode of Fintech Daydreaming. But as always, I'm not doing this alone. I'm doing this with my great friend and co-host Paul Krogdahl. So I always have to ask you, how are you, Paul, today?
Why do you have to always ask me?
I don't know.
I mean, you don't have to. I could just sit quietly in the corner like some gnome. I mean, if you really want to.
So, like usual, right?
Like, oi, behave. No, I'm really good, Ville. I'm really good. I'm getting actually quite excited about the Nordic FinTech Summit on the 11th of May, where we are going to absolutely rock the show, right?
We're actually going to do a stage takeover there for the first time in FinTech Daydreaming history, which is going to be fun. Especially because we have topics like Web3 and central bank digital currencies, stablecoins, all the fun stuff that everybody disagrees about. So we love environments like that. And of course, we're going to do the live episode alongside of that for your listeners to find out later as well. But yeah, looking forward to it a lot.
Can I do a stage dive? I mean, if we're doing a stage takeover, can I
suppose with the thousands of people, in the front row, we can
all sitting on the front row, and I'll just dive over them. I think that would be a perfect way of starting a summit.
All right. Okay. Stop talking, Paul. We have other things to do today. Because again, as fun as it might be, and I'm putting that in quotation marks, to listen to us go back and forth. We do this podcast for our guests because the guests are the stars of the show as always. And today is a really, really special day because we have star like no other as our guest, Dr. Leda Glyptis. So Leda, how are you today?
I'm great. I was enjoying the back and forth actually. And now I have a vision of you stage diving at a fintech conference and everyone going, "Oh no, not on my new designer trainers," and jumping out of the way.
I think it would be a perfect way to start the whole thing off, right?
Oh yeah. Stage diving right to the floor. So that's the good way to start any podcast, right?
Yep.
Great. Glad you enjoyed the back and forth. We do this all the time, even in the live shows sometimes. But Leda, we usually do a couple of cliches on our shows, and the first cliche we do is, of course, we ask for you to tell a little bit about yourself for the audience and who you are, where you're coming from, for the 5 people that might not know who you are. And then the second part of the introduction, we ask, what is your superpower? So please.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited. I'm enjoying this already immensely. So I am, for the 5 people who don't know me, I am Leda Glyptis. I am the Chief Client Officer of 10x Banking, where we build cloud native core banking systems. I've been in the industry for a long time. I was on a list of fintech veterans before COVID. So that's quite a few years ago. And it's like, I think I'm officially old now. That's what this means. I'm actually officially old. But I've been doing this work for a long time. And I think for those of us doing this work for a long time, we can look back and say it's been a uniquely interesting time, because my career started accidentally in a small company. We didn't call them fintech back then, but that's what it was. Ended up working in some of the biggest banks in the world and went back into fintech. But if I trace the time, I've been here pretty much for the whole time that this fintech wave and digital transformation wave has been picking up speed. And that's super lucky, because you come into the space now, it's too huge to wrap your arms around it. Whereas for those of us who came into the space in 2006, 2007, there was a crisis, of course, and there was a sort of gloom and doom in the financial services industry. But if you look back, what a time to have been in the industry. And I think that's what I benefit from. I've been doing the work of bringing new technology into banks in a variety of roles in a variety of banks for the best part of 20 years, and possibly the most fascinating time there has been in this industry. Now, my superpower here, this one was easier than the next question you're going to ask me, actually, as I was thinking about it. I've described myself as Captain Obvious quite often, Ville, and I think that is my superpower, in that I have, over the years, made an art of saying the things that are possibly too obvious to acknowledge. And sometimes they're so obvious that you think you must be missing something, or you feel that there might be a sacred cow. I find that very often people think of something and they don't bring it up because they think, well, there are people in the room who are smarter than me, then people in the room more experienced than me. There are people in the room better paid than me. If they're not saying it, I'm probably missing something. Chances are no, you're not missing anything. So my superpower over the years has been to be Captain Obvious. 50% of the time, there's a blind spot. 25% of the time, it's a courage issue. 25% of the time, you make a fool of yourself, but it's worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Captain Obvious is always better than, Captain Hindsight. Hindsight 2020 would be like...
Exactly.
I think that needs to be a conference, maybe, Hindsight 2020. Anyway, so...
It should be 3 days after Money 2020, right?
Yeah, I think we're onto something here. That should be like, that's the thing we're going to host next time for sure. But yeah, again, fantastic to have you on, and you kind of covered a lot of the introduction there. But before we get to the rest of the content, we do have another tradition, superpower being the number one. The number two is something that our audience is expecting every time, and that's of course the fintech joke. So, would you have a joke for our audience today?
I don't. I feel like I failed you miserably. I don't have a joke, but I have a little bit of a funny story.
Okay.
Right. So, while I was living in the Middle East, I was the chief innovation officer of a very, very large bank in the Middle East, which is going to be very easy to find for anyone who looks at my CV online. We did a robotics process automation program. So it was actually quite an ambitious program. We did it in a really cool way, because rather than doing an RFP, we did a couple of parallel pilots so that we could learn in the process, and it was actually learning by it. It was great. But we got to the point where we had to actually activate the nodes. And to activate the nodes, as you guys definitely know, your listeners probably also know, you have to give them login credentials. But we were in the Middle East, so giving them login credentials involved giving them genders, because all login credentials were gendered. So I walk into my office one day and my team is there on the whiteboard writing names down really deep into a conversation. I was like, what are you doing? I'm like, we're naming the nodes and we're creating gender parity. And there was some people in the room who were like, no, we should reflect the statistics of the organization. And I was like, no, make all of them women, be rebellious. And then in the end, we went for 50-50. And we actually had to name the nodes. And people got very emotional about some of the nodes being named after them. 50% girl robots and 50% boy robots. And of course, after I told some of the people who weren't in technology this story, they came in and they were like, where are the robots? Because they expected to see, Pepper And I was like, oh my God.
That's wonderful. In actual fact, before we move
definitely
on,
qualifies.
I've got a quick question, because I you said you were Chief Innovation Officer. We seem to be in a paradigm these days where there is a chief everything. I'm waiting for someone to publicly announce that they're the Chief Fluff Officer for a fintech.
I
But
like that job.
yeah, I'd really like to know, what does a Chief Client Officer do?
Chief Client Officer has both sides of a client relationship under your remit, both bringing in the clients and keeping them happy. So it's a combination of pre-sales, marketing, sales, and then client solutions architecture and delivery and account management. I think in a lot of organizations, the role would be a chief revenue officer or chief commercial officer. At 10x, we pride ourselves on partnerships with our clients. It's not just about them. I mean, we like the money. Obviously, I like money. But it's not just about the revenue number. It's also about, are we actually achieving that 10x uplift? Are we partnering them to do better every step of the way? So the responsibility to bring them in and keep them happy and make sure they achieve that 10x uplift goes beyond the revenue. So Chief Client Officer.
Fantastic. Thank you.
All right. Are you clear with that now, Paul?
I am, yes, but I'm still convinced that when we start our bank, Ville, I want to be the Chief Fluff Officer. Okay.
Okay.
I would quite like that. I would quite like, every time I discuss titles with anyone in my career, I try for Queen of Everything and Chief Ballerina, and nobody takes me seriously, but one of these days.
That's
I
perfect.
was once working in a place where there was a person that was really had the title the General Manager of General Affairs. I think that's like the perfect title for everything, I guess. All right, so let's move ahead with the conversation, because we have a lot of ground to cover today. Now, I did want to go back a little bit on your background, actually, because I've been in the fintech around the same time as you, I would say, roughly. A fintech before fintech was fintech, and you mentioned that compared to from back then to today, it's just such a massive field. Compared to, of course, it being very much a niche back then when we started. But I mean, is there anything else between when you started and today? What would be the kind of top two things for you to mention besides the size, and how things are different these days? Because I'm sure there's a lot.
No, you're right. It is very different. I think that the size I've already mentioned, but I don't think we can underestimate it. When I started my career, the fintech world, and I put it in quotation marks because we all knew what we meant, but the definitions are weird and wonderful, right? You could fit us all in one room, and we all knew each other back then. And it's a fantastic thing that it has grown as huge as it has. And of course, it's impossible for everyone to know everyone now. And the fintech world is not an industry, it's multiple industries, and that's fantastic. And actually, it's happened really quickly. But I think pausing to appreciate just how radical that transformation has been. Now the crypto world and the Web3 world is a separate industry with areas of expertise. Back then, only 15, 16, 17 years ago, that didn't even exist, to be fair. And all the things will be part. I remember in my first fintech scouting conversation with some of the investment people at the bank, it was crowdsourcing, P2P lending, APIs, some early machine learning, like all the things were in one bucket. So we've gone a very long way. I think you asked me for two, so I'm not going to count that one because I had said it before. So the two things I would say in that context that have changed a lot. The first one is the realization that has finally dawned on banks that they're not in control of the pace. I think even 5-6 years ago, the way that banks and financial services institutions engaged with new technology, new regulation, startups, you got a feeling that financial service institutions felt in control, not of digitization. We could tell that it was happening, but in control of how fast, how far, which parts. You know, when DLT first appeared, the conversations were like, do we want this? The penny has dropped. It's not about do we want any of this. The economy is digital. The world around us is moving faster than financial services. But that mind shift is huge. The second thing that has happened is, and it goes to the first thing I was saying, that there's so much now. The approach inside financial services had been, let's put our arms around everything, let's understand everything, let's learn everything, then choose. But the breadth, width, and depth of all the things that you could possibly learn is not only too wide, but it's actually exponentially growing faster than we're learning. So the strategy of how to cope with disruption has gone out the window. The good news is no one's really winning at this yet. The bad news is we need a new plan.
Any ideas what that new plan might look like?
Well, yes, actually, but it's not it's a straightforward answer, but it's not easy to implement. And the reality is, as anyone trying to survive as a business in a digital economy, you need to take a step back and work out whether you're still fulfilling your purpose or whether that's shifting, whether you're doing it in a way where your unit economics are viable or whether you're actually eating into your own margin and driving yourself into a wall, and whether the new technologies that are coming down the pipe help you solve for one or two. That's it. It's not a, look, DLT, where do I put it? It's a case of, what am I here to do? Am I doing it in a way that is capturing a meaningful market share? And are the tools I'm using to do it driving enough unit economic uplift in a digital distribution model so as to say, I have the right infrastructure? If the answer to those things is yes, you don't actually need to do much differently. But I bet the answer will be yes. And it won't stay yes for long. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, I actually interrupted you, so I apologize for that. But I'm actually starting to feel like we are really actually now getting to that point that Bill Gates was getting to when he once said, we all need banking, but no one needs banks. Right?
Arguably, we never needed banks. It was a way of organizing and regulating the activities that we needed doing. So I like that statement, because if you take it as it is intended, take it a step up and go, did we ever need banks? Or was it just a way of delivering the work?
I guess we're still trying to figure out what could be the better option for not having banks as they are defined today. And that's going to be a gradual process for sure. Speaking of segues, the reason I kind of wanted to establish a timeline from your beginning into the fintech into where we are today is because we need to congratulate you on your new book, of course, which is called Bankers Like Us. And when I read the headline, of course, I ask, do they really like us?
Somebody else told me that back. Like us, and I was like, you wish.
But again, I have a copy right here. Thank you for signing it, Leda. So again, I got this when we met at the Finovate conference earlier this year. And I've been enjoying the book as well. But for our listeners who still maybe haven't read the book, maybe could you tell a little bit about what the book is about and what inspired you to write it?
So for the listeners that don't know, I have a column on Fintech Futures every Thursday under the general rubric Leader Rights. The column has been dealing with topics around leadership and transformation and the frustrations of our everyday life in our industry. And after years of writing the column, and quite a few folks who are loyal readers saying, when's the book coming? Tanya Andressian, who's the managing editor of Fintech Futures, said, okay, it's time. And she brokered a conversation for me with Taylor and Francis, the academic publisher in the US. And then I had to write the proposal, right? You're not going to let Tanya down. I must admit, when I tell this story, I always feel the need to pause and say, like, that's, as a woman, you're always told, you know, find women who will name drop you in a room full of opportunity. Tanya went and built the building, right? She actually went out of her way to make this introduction for me because she knew that I wasn't going to do it for myself. But once the introduction was there, of course, I wrote my proposal. So the proposal was to build on the most successful themes of the column and maybe reuse some of the ideas. It failed miserably, even though that's what I tried to do. As you probably have realized reading the book, that's not what it is. I tried to do that, and it just didn't read okay. It felt like it was forced. So I took a step back and thought, what's the column about? It's about all the things that frustrate me. But that's really a not negative note to create a book on. So the book is all the things that frustrate me and what do they have in common? And what they have in common has nothing to do with technology and everything to do with humans and the organizational choices we make and the habits we've created for ourselves. So the first half of the book is a deep dive into those themes. I think a lot of it will be familiar from the column, even though it's in a lot more depth. And then the second half of the book is, okay, what can we do about this? On an individual level, on a team level, and on an organizational level. And hand on heart, I'll say two things about the call to arms. Everything is actionable. None of it is vague, do better. It's actually all quite specific. If you want to do it, you can do it. The second thing is that it ranges from the very small and mundane, because not everyone wants to rock the boat, to certain choices that in order to make them, you would have to transform your organization to distribute profit differently. It's doable. You might choose not to do it.
Do you feel that your book is written for a specific set of readers, or has it been written to encapsulate as many varied reader communities as possible?
It's a very good question, and we went back and forth with my publisher a lot, because what he was saying is you swap out the banking examples. This applies to everybody. And he was saying this applies to publishing. This probably applies to pharmaceuticals. This applies to any big established industry that is trying to transform itself. I struggled a little bit with that, because although I totally agree with him, and I think that if you're inclined to look for these patterns, you'll find them. In our industry, my most common experience is people trying to tell me why the thing I'm talking about doesn't apply to them. So I find that because I have really deep banking knowledge, I can argue with very specific examples that are deep in the legacy tech and deep in the regulation and deep in how you price a financial instrument. And that's how I win the argument, by having very deep credentials in the industry. So it has been written for a banking audience, but anyone in another industry who's willing to look for a way out, I think would find it useful. But it wouldn't convince the unconvinced, because I wouldn't be able to tell you the equivalent example of pharmaceuticals that says, no, you're not exempt. When you apply that that abstract statement to your everyday life, it looks like this.
Yeah, certainly for us fintech nerds, it's definitely a fascinating book, because you can basically recognize all the problems, especially if we ever worked inside a bank trying to get something new done. There's so many good stories there that are easy to identify with those stories. So completely appreciate the moving into doing it this way, for sure. But let's dive a little bit deeper into the premise. I mean, I guess this book would not exist today if a change and new development in financial institutions would be easy. What do you think? Why is transformation and change so difficult, especially in banking?
I think there are a couple of reasons, right? The first one that we don't acknowledge enough is it's hard. It's hard work. and it's work that comes without a blueprint. We have to change a lot of very complicated things, and we don't know what we need to change them to. We know what we need to change them towards, but we don't know what the end state looks like. We don't know when it's finished. We don't know how far we need to go. And every day that passes that we don't start the work, it's more complicated and further away. So I think it's fair to say part of what makes it difficult is that it is hard. The second reason, though, is that we make it hard for ourselves. And a lot of what the book is about is exactly the ways in which people and organizations make it harder to do this work. Some of it is unintentional. The way we organize our days, the way we organize our time, both within the day and across a quarter, doesn't lend itself to long-term learning. It doesn't lend itself to strategic planning. It makes us more short-termist. It doesn't lend itself to unpacking complicated issues. But equally, it's much more close to home. If you worked really hard to get to the big job in the bank, and not only are you not getting the corner office and the cushy job that maybe someone in the 80s had, you're being asked to make decisions about things that are very new. You don't understand them. They don't fit into the way your boss measures value. And you're being asked to continue delivering against the expectations of the shareholders and transform the organization for the future while managing risk.
But this is more of an issue for, can we say, incumbent banks than the industry. If we look at fintechs and other disruptive forces in the industry, I think it's the mentality of the incumbent banks which is struggling with this innovation and shift.
It's I wish I could agree with you, but actually, I see some of those patterns in a lot of the startups.
Okay.
But for different reasons. The reason that the startups struggle is that the vast majority of startups are not bootstrapped. They have VC money, and VC money, growth is God. And you feed that God. And then when there are cycles in the economy like there are now, you scramble to make choices that don't match your strategic roadmap. So we've seen so many of startups make cuts in the last year and a half, withdraw from certain markets. So some of that disconnect between what you're trying to achieve and the time in which you're trying to achieve it and how you measure value, some of those challenges exist across the board. And you could say it is because traditional VCs operate in a very traditional FS mindset, right?
And I couldn't agree more with you, Leda. It's typically when you get a fintech that says that they have solved all your problems with a technology, they don't really understand the problem. So that's that seems to be, especially in the blockchain and DLT space, back when I was working for a bank, happened a lot of times. All you need to do is to scratch the surface a little bit and actually talk to the people who are doing that activity, whatever it might be. You realize exactly that was already talked about. These problems are not technology problems; they are people problems, agreeing on things. In my mind, at least. I mean, just today alone, I've had 2 discussions about why can't we interoperate, or why aren't these systems interoperable? It's not because we cannot technically connect these systems. It's actually because the owners of those networks don't agree on the principle of being connected. So again, it's about people more than technology, and it seems to apply especially in banking when trying to push forward change as well. But one of the memes that it's also in industry seems to be that banks are actually built by design to resist change. And maybe a bit of a different spin to the question there is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, some people would argue that the banks are resisting change and built like that, and in order to have stability into the system. And that's why it's a good thing that they don't change. At least they don't change fast. Do you agree with that statement? Is it a good thing or a bad thing?
if they have been built by design to resist change intentionally. Because the way we understand financial services now seems so solid, but actually it's the last 50, 60 years. The early days of Wall Street were cowboys, right? They were opportunistic businessmen who saw an opening and just went for it. Yeah. So this sort of static, respectable, risk-averse image that we have of the industry, which I agree is fairly true of what we see around us now, is not actually that old. So that's thing number one. Is it better than the opportunistic minds? I watched the Lehman trilogy at the theater recently, and I was thinking about it quite a lot. Is it better? I think it's different. It serves a different purpose. When we're talking about the banking ecosystem now, we think about, you know, the regulatory duty of care of the consumer component. And I'm a fan, right? I prefer a financial services ecosystem that thinks of itself as having a duty of care to the consumer, which means that you will be risk averse. But risk averse doesn't mean no change. It just means cautious, tested change. We've taken certain things a bit too much to heart. What I like to point out to when banks say, oh, you know, we're not very good at change, is we're actually very good at change when we understand it. And I think that's the biggest thing. Like if you look at algo trading is my favorite example. It was a radically different technology with radically different pricing, with radically different risk matrices, but banks embraced it because they could understand how to use it. They could understand how to make money with it. They could understand the risks and the rewards. I think part of the challenge we have with the digital era is that there's a lot of complexity that is still not fully understood. And let's call it out. A lot of what digital connectivity has done is cut into the margin of what used to be very profitable ways of doing business. And now it's an embedded distribution model. And you won't charge the same for an API call as you did for a report. You just won't. So being able to find how to create value, extract value, and protect that value while doing the work is actually the right way of thinking about things. It's just that I think in trying to do that, the FS world became slightly overwhelmed by choice. And it goes back to what you were saying earlier. There was a lot of technology coming our way that developed actually outside FS largely. And there were a lot of startups doing what looked like really interesting work, being fueled by VC money that gave you so much choice inside the industry, which was slightly overwhelming. And quite a few entities, if you look back, have spent a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of energy, but not actually made a lot of commitments in the last 15 years.
Yeah. There's always this shiny new thing syndrome happening. You know, lately, I guess everybody has had to have an opinion about generative AI and how ChatGPT is changing your particular business. And this, of course, banking is not immune to that conversation either. But just we don't want to go down that rabbit hole. So let's move on to the next topic that I really want to touch, because we talk about a lot in our podcast about basically how banks are becoming greener or seek to becoming greener or more ESG friendly. And we always seem to conclude that a lot of it is just basically greenwashing. Now, one of the themes that you cover quite extensively in your book, Leda, is the diversity angle. I mean, and in my opinion, I'm seeing similar kind of signaling from a lot of financial institutions saying that, you know, they are the most diverse and most equal in the world. Is this narrative suffering from a similar kind of greenwashing than this environmental values are?
Thank you for feeding me that. Yes, 100%. As I'm pretty sure you know from the way you phrased that question. 100%. And we see several flavors of that. We see people hiring women and patronizing them. We see people paying lip service to inclusion equality. So they have the diversity, but when those diverse communities have diverse needs or say, you know what it feels like to be at the receiving end of that, you get shut down. my pet peeve is that diversity and inclusion is spoken of in a very soft language, and actually ESG is as well. We're all friends here. It's all very constructive. We're doing the right thing. And part of me likes that. But most of me doesn't like that, because the reality is we have a problem. And unless we talk about the problem and we dance around it about how everyone is doing the right thing, we won't solve the problem. I gave a talk recently, and it was a dinner talk. And I was trying so hard to be constructive. And I was speaking to one of my friends who was also coming to the dinner. And she said, you're not going to do any of the women in that dinner a service by holding back. So I didn't. I ended up saying, look, I'm struggling to make this positive. But the reality is every woman I know has been sexually propositioned in the workplace. Every woman I know has been belittled. Every woman I know has been called sweetheart or bitch, or has been asked if she's on her period, or has been told to not worry her pretty little head. Every woman I know has had to face into double standards more than once. Every woman I know has been asked to do things better, faster, or put down for not doing exactly the same as her male counterparts. And every woman I know has had to deal with that more than once. So we talk about diversity and inclusion issues like they're victimless crimes, but they're not, because we're at the receiving end of it. So let's take it a step forward. Can you fix diversity and inclusion without acknowledging the people who suffer from it and the perpetrators? And that's where it falls down. If you want to fix it, you need to look at who's suffering and who's causing it. And when you're looking at who's suffering, part of who's suffering is your business. Diverse business performing better, 100%. You're going to have access to better talent if you look at 100% of the population and not 20%. You're going to have fewer blind spots. These statistics are proven, right? So, and yet we don't look at the perpetrators. So my biggest issue is that if we try to make it all soft, fluffy, and positive, we dance around the biggest issue, which is who's causing this. Because it's happening. We all know it's happening. How can we fix it without addressing who's causing it? So everything from, the hard choices, ESG, without the hard choices, you can't always do offsets, right? That can't be the plan. But that is the plan for most of the entities. So make the hard choices, face into the hard decisions, or spare us,
We like to give our listeners superpowers. And in this case, I feel like we have a chance to give them one as well, which is the ability to identify institutions where things are being done right in this regard. Do you have any tips for our listeners to have that extra vision on looking at certain identifiers in institutions where things are being done right when it comes to diversity, and maybe even ESG?
You have to look through the narrative, right? Because everyone talks a good game. When I was very young, I had just started my career. I went to a talk and somebody said, "Oh, culture is what happens when nobody's watching." And I was like, "Whoa, that's so deep." But as I've almost 20 years on, I'm thinking, actually, no. It's what you do when it's difficult. And people are watching, actually. It's not true that your culture is what people are doing when nobody's watching. It's what you do when you stop caring that people are watching because your bottom line is on the line, because it's inconvenient, because you might need to say no to a client, because someone you went to university with might need to be fired or disciplined or. Employees always know. Employees absolutely always know. And if you're trying to determine where your company really lands, think about the moments where a hard choice had to be made. That's the only truth that matters, right? Everything else is narrative.
Twisting this back around a little bit, like you said that early on, you had some discussion about whether the content in your book can go cross industries or very specific to banking. Taking that back to this subject, do you think that it's more prevalent in the banking industry than in other industries?
Part of me hopes so, because if there are industries that are worse than ours, that's pretty disastrous. But friends who are medics, tell me that racism and sexism is rampant, try being an Asian doctor who doesn't get called nurse 20 times a day, right? There's nothing wrong with being a nurse, but the automatic assumption is there. There are industries where it isn't as bad, but I don't think it's I don't think we're that unique. And the reality is challenging is jarring, but that's the only way to stop it being normal. Because if you do something that isn't right and you're never called out, there's a 1% chance that you're doing it because you don't know it's not okay. Like I was at a meeting recently, and somebody for whom English is not their first language commented on something and used a word that made someone else in that room, they called them colored. And then there was a teachable moment, right? And they took it and was like, don't call me that, because actually it comes with like very, very strong colonial implications and it makes me feel awful. And the person who had said it said, oh my God, I'm really, really sorry. What should I say instead? Now that doesn't happen very often, but there is always the chance that someone is causing hurt or offense because they have a blind spot. Call it out. If it was a blind spot, you've made the world better for everyone. If it wasn't a blind spot, you've just warned them that they won't get away with it anymore.
That's
have to do it again.
And that is definitely great advice. I couldn't agree more. Especially when dealing with different cultures, you do a lot of times those things happen because you just don't know the language. You don't know any better. So I think that's the only way to fix that problem for sure. But we also want to cover a couple of more topics before we run out of time, and I'm really concerned that we could continue for like 2 hours here. But
Come back.
That's a promise. Great. But one thing I did want to cover is because when I was reading the book, I found myself almost like, chuckling, laughing and shaking my head so many times because the stories were so relatable. And you have a lot of great stories from personal experience in there. But do you have a favorite one that you would like to tell a little bit maybe why a certain story might be your favorite so that we don't spoil the good parts of the book, but maybe tell a little bit about the favorite story maybe?
I think that there are a lot of stories in the book, and it was actually one of the things that my publisher really encouraged me to do a lot of, because there are a lot of books out there that mostly are written by futurists. So there are no like in the trenches stories, and I'm glad you chuckled. That was the idea. We have to laugh through it. There are a lot of stories in there that I love to tell, a bit like my robot story, because they're quite funny and they make a point really well. But my favorite story in the book is the story of the optimists, because that's one of mine. I don't think that no matter how many years I spend in this industry, I think that will forever stay one of my happiest things to have been a part of in this organization, in this space. And without giving too much away, when I worked at BNY Mellon, I don't name them in the book, but I think it's pretty obvious who they were. A group of us would get together and chat, and we would. BNY Mellon in the European headquarters, I don't know if they have it still, but they had an atrium in the basement that was just light and bright and glorious, and it was where our cafeteria was. But a lot of the senior people had offices that looked into the atrium. I went upstairs once after a meeting, and our EMEA CIO, a chap called Mark Librizzi, absolutely wonderful man, was like, tap on the shoulder, what was that? You guys looked so energized. What were you talking about? And we had been talking about something that was bugging all of us, and we're trying to help each other out, give each other ideas. But we thought we were busted because, even though BNY has an amazing culture, actually, of all the banks I've worked in, the most inclusive and sort of friendly, but still a big bank. And you're like, we're busted. We were busted not working, essentially. So we explained that it was a group of friends who have the courage to say, I'm stuck and I need help. Have the willingness to take time out of the day to help each other. And we had this rule that we would keep our moan conversion ratio trending to 1. So bring your problems, but let's solve them. We can't be the people that get together just to complain. So problem brought over problem solved, the ratio had to be trending to 1. Otherwise, we were just moaning. And he told on us, he went to the CEO. And the CEO loved it. I thought, this is it, we're busted. The CEO loved it. And we got so much support and resources and the encouragement of the organization to go out more widely and say to people, look, if you're willing to just find a way, the organization won't fight us. And there was a magical time, actually, where when we started, there was a little bit of rebellion in it. Like, let's push, let's see what happens. With the blessing of the organization, you had a lot of people who wouldn't risk their careers on this, but actually were willing and able to be hugely helpful. And that was a wonderful period of time, just to see that energy between colleagues. It's one, I think no matter what I achieve, it will be one of my happiest memories.
Yeah, I think in the book you describe it so that it's that little group of rebels that started it suddenly then became a movement, and now it's much larger. And even, you know, after the original group is have moved on, the whole thing still continues to this date, I believe.
It does. What I don't know is how it feels to be in it, but it still exists.
Yeah, and that is powerful. We need to get somebody from BNY Mellon to confirm that it's still going on. So
yes, we should. Yep. You know who you should get on here, actually? Katie.
I think
Katie needs the CRO from asset servicing, who is a CRO and, you know, big job.
All right. I think we will use your reference to get her on the podcast. Great. We have a lot of listeners. Speaking of people working in the banks, we have a lot of listeners especially here in the Nordics, working in banks and literally working in the trenches of trying to make new things happen in the digitalization side, innovation side, bringing new products, trying to transform the bank. Since the theme of your book is basically stories from the trenches, and these people are in the trenches. Now, as a final point in our conversation today, do you have any wise words of encouragement for these people that are doing this on a day-to-day basis here in the cold, dark Nordics?
I love the Nordics. I love the cold, dark Nordics. I have a section in the book, and actually I've written about it in my column as well, around the idea of friends in low places. And I am a firm believer that in order to survive doing this work in a big organization, you need friends in low places. And by low places, I don't mean insignificant people. I mean people who don't necessarily have the seniority, but they have the willingness to help you do the work. I must admit that if I look back, every single time I got stuck, I wasn't helped by the people above me. I was helped by the people in the trenches with me. I know I talk about my tribe a lot. Absolutely find your tribe. But your tribe is not like a Panini sticker collection. It's not about, you know, how many very important people do you have in your Rolodex? Don't have those anymore. Children, that's your phone book on your phone. It's not about, you know, big names and people saying hello to you at a conference. Your tribe are the people who are going to help you out in the day-to-day. They might not work in your organization. They might work in a partner organization. They might work in a client organization, or they might work in your organization, but in a different department. Find them. They're not going to be the most senior people. They're not going to be the most important people, but they will be the people who will roll their sleeves up when you're stuck and say, how can I help you? And they will do things that you either can't do. Like I remember sitting late at night with a colleague helping me manually scramble data because we couldn't anonymize the data for an experiment with IBM, actually. I didn't know how to do that. And the people who were meant to do that for me had a 6-month delay or whatever. Well, I don't think it was 6 months, but it was too late for it to not kill the project. That person had things to do that evening, and they didn't do it for the bank. They did it for me. Yeah. Find your tribe.
Find your tribe. That's words of wisdom right there. So, as we say on the podcast here, time is always running out when you're having fun, and we have certainly had a lot of stuff today. We could continue for another 3 hours, I believe. So we're going to have to get you back to finish on things we didn't get a chance to talk about today. But before we close, was there anything you really wanted to get out there during this first appearance on the podcast that we didn't get a chance to talk about yet?
Actually, no. We've talked about a lot of things very close to my heart, so I'm very happy.
Except for please buy my book.
Paul?
You need to point up and say, please buy my book. Yeah. Please buy the book.
Even I can do that. Please buy it.
Please buy my book and leave a loving review on Amazon.
Exactly.
All right. Paul, any parting words before we close it?
No, I think it's, as always, another fantastically good discussion. Really been looking forward to having you join us here for this discussion as well. So, no, I have nothing more to say except for thank you very much for joining us. And I hope you're going to be there when I do my first stage dive in a conference.
I really hope so too.
Yeah.
I will not be one of the people who will move aside. I promise to catch you.
Now that's a promise right there. Now all we have left to do now, of course, Leda, how can people find you? How can people find the book? Where can they buy it? And how can they be in touch?
The book is available on Amazon and on the Routledge website. And I am on LinkedIn and Twitter at Leda Glyptis. I'm also on Mastodon, but I just can't get myself using it.
All right. And thank you so much for being on. It's been a fantastic discussion, exactly like we expected. Now, all the usual things, dear listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, and I know you have, please hit that like button and do write those reviews. They are very important, especially when they're 5 stars and you actually write one. That really helps us find new listeners for this great fintech nerdiness that you've been hearing for even on this week. So with that being said, thank you very much for listening. This has been Fintech Daydreaming.
This is Fintech Daydreaming.